We haven't talked about tariffs in quite some time. Between the Strait of Hormuz being closed and the stuff happening at the Federal Reserve, the tariffs have been kind of overlooked. But I hate to be the bearer of bad news, the tariffs are not done. They're not done, even though the Supreme Court ruled earlier this year that the IEEPA tariffs that were instituted last year were unconstitutional. This administration has been slowly figuring out ways to reinstitute those tariffs, and I want to talk about some of the details. So Jamieson Greer announced last night on Tuesday, June 2nd, that the plan was to institute between a 10 to 12.5% tariff on about 59 countries, along with the 27 nation European Union. And the way they're planning on doing this is instituting something known as a Section 301 tariff. According to US law, Section 301 tariffs can be instituted against other countries if it is determined that those countries are impeding US commerce. This is not the first time that this administration, in both this current term and the previous term, have implemented Section 301 tariffs. In fact, between 2018 and 2019, this administration in their first term instituted Section 301 tariffs on China, which to this day still remain in effect. However, this is the most extensive use of Section 301 tariffs on these countries, and the reason the administration is saying they are going to implement them is because these nations have failed to enact or effectively enforce laws prohibiting imports made with forced labor. Now, interestingly, with this announcement came a 98-page detailed report about why these tariffs should be implemented, including all of the reasoning behind the forced labor argument. The current administration is implementing this 10% tariff on the EU to begin with because they are not adopting regulations banning imports with forced labor fast enough. Ban is coming at the end of 2027, and a spokesperson for the European Commission also announced that the EU and the US have been working together and actually have a joint agreement to protect labor rights by ending these imports made with forced labor. So it's unclear if at the end of 2027, once these forced labor regulations go into effect in the EU, whether the tariffs would also end. There's nothing in the report that signals that. And also, interestingly, there are several products that are exempted from these tariffs, including things like beef, bananas, coffee, and steel, and a slate of critical minerals, which at the last year, the prices of which increased very dramatically because the US doesn't have any or limited capacity to produce a lot of the imports that are exempted. Right? Tariffs are not necessarily a bad thing and can be used in certain instances to protect industries located in the United States. And yes, we do grow some coffee in Hawaii, but not nearly the supply that we would need to sustain the entire United States. So a coffee tariff or a banana tariff, for example, really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And ultimately, right, as we've seen over the last year, tariffs are a tax that is ultimately passed on to consumers, right? It costs money with tariffs to import goods into the United States, and most of the time, the vast majority of the time, businesses are passing that cost onto consumers. And you have to weigh whether or not the benefits of the tariff, like the potential protection of industries in the long run, is worth increasing prices for US consumers, especially as we've seen other types of inflation increase very recently. Now, the question you might be asking yourself, or at least I was, is that, Sarah, is the US even following its own regulations and own standards when it comes to forced labor? Technically, US law prohibits the importation of goods made with forced labor. The Tariff Act of 1930 explicitly bans any import of any goods made with forced labor. However, it is important to note that it is estimated that nearly $170 billion of goods made with forced labor at some point in their manufacturing are imported into the United States every year. And the reason why this happens despite US law is because a lot of the goods that are produced with forced labor are raw materials. And so if other countries are importing goods with raw materials and then they manufacture something else and then those goods are imported into the United States, right, that isn't tracked as a good produced with forced labor. It's somewhere through the supply chain where it's affected. It's also important to note, right, that forced labor is a form of labor exploitation. And the Department of Homeland Security themselves has documented several instances in the United States of labor exploitation in industries like agriculture, like construction, like retail and food service. 71% of those individuals entered the country on lawful H-2A and H-2B visas. But there doesn't seem to be any effort, right, to address the labor conditions for those individuals who are on those visas in the United States. And interestingly, when I'm reading the media and the news story articles about these tariffs, there doesn't seem to be any indication that there is any interest in pointing out that disparity, right? We are targeting countries for importing products with forced labor, while not addressing the forced labor and labor exploitation practices happening in the United States itself. Now, am I saying that I am pro forced labor and I think that we should import goods and support these economies that are implementing these practices? No, that is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that this interest in forced labor to implement tariffs that ultimately are taxed on American consumers seems like a little bit of a roundabout way to get a policy that you want that was overturned by the Supreme Court, especially given the fact that there have been several efforts over the last few months to implement tariffs since then that have all been overturned by the courts up until now. There doesn't seem to be any interest, and I can only speculate as to why that is. But for now, we'll just have to wait until July when the hearings about whether or not these tariffs will be implemented should occur. But for now, that's all I got. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know.